Hello and welcome to this B1 usability package session on how to create an end-to-end plugin for the new B1 usability package 5.0 plugin system. So the session will have a sample in which we need to create some new functionality which the usability package can't handle by itself, and we need a plugin and some custom code to do it. The sample is that we have an import file that contains some items that have a price list, a price, and a currency. And we need to import those into business1. So we want to have that we have a new menu item under inventory called update prices. When we press that, it should open up a little file dialog choosing the file, and once selected we should have an import and a confirmation that when the data is imported to the system. We will then package up that source code we make into a package and set it to run with usability package. So let's get going. First thing we need to do is we need to go to our usability package installation file that we downloaded with the installation bit, and under documentation, plugin system, we have the plugin development kit. So let's try to extract that into here, and here we have the folder. What is inside the folder? Well, there's some requirements on what you need to build your plugin for, some implementation guide, and so on. If we look at the requirements real quick, you'll see some general guidelines on what we need to work with. We need to work with .NET Framework 3.5, it should be built on SL9, so a lot of different good rules to set up. You should read this in details before you begin. In here there's also some sample packages where you can see the end result being these files, while in our case we will use the empty plugins source because we want to build a plugin entirely from scratch. So a plugin exists of a DLL called B1UP that we need to reference, and a plugin here. We have C# versions of the plugin system, and we also have VB versions if needed. So let's open up this. I have it open here, and let's go through what there is in the different parts of the plugin. Let's look at the Solution Explorer first, where we can see we have a My First Plugin with a single file called MyPlugin. You can add multiple files, you can add multiple projects if you need to, but here you have all the essentials to start working with. In the references, you will see that we have a reference to the B1UP plugin DLL, and we of course have references to SAP Ops.com and SAP BUI, all depending on what you need in the system. Your main entry point of your solution is one of your classes, in this case MyPlugin, need to inherit from the plugin mod adapter, which comes from the B1UP plugin. So let's go through the different things that is in the empty source code here, and let's adjust them as accordingly. The first thing is our constructor, and here we need to take some few decisions. First of all, if we want to have a license check, you can be hooked into the normal B1UP license check if needed. If so, if you want to do that in a plugin, you need to contact the B1UP IT team in order to actually get a license key in the system. But in this case, it's just a little free plugin I make, so I will say it's false. And the second thing I need to tell is I need to tell my plugin identifier. It should follow a namespace if you have one. In our case it's POY, and let me call it test plugin. Now that our constructor is set, you'll see that in the sample we have a lot of different methods that you can call in the system, and all of these are, as you can see, is overwritten, so they come from the plugin adapter. So if we just quickly have a look in there, you can see all the different members, and you can see they are virtual. So that means that you can override them if you need to, and if you don't want to do any of the parts, we will just handle that part for you if needed. Only one you need to register is the add-on filter, and that is the only one that is required. The rest of them are all optional. So if you have an add-on, in our case we will never use the setup fields, so we don't need any user-defined fields, so we don't want to have that. So let's move on to that. The first one we have here is setup language. Setup language is where you can set up that your add-on runs different languages in different setups. So if you use the regx files in C#, you can go about setting up that this is different cultures based on the SAP language. In our case, we just make a simple plugin for one language, being English. So in our case, we will just remove that, but you can make languages as you see fit. Next up is setup menu items, where we set up the different menu items we want to have in our system. And in our case, we wanted one menu item under the inventory item. So let's write some code that reflects that. Okay, so now I have written the code that needs to be done here. I'm not going into the details on this code because it's simply standard SDK development into the UI and SDK development into the DI. But what I'm essentially doing is I'm making a new menu item, and I check up if that menu item already exists, or if it doesn't exist, I add it to the inventory submenu in the system. In a similar fashion, I need to do the same for remove menu items. So every time I stop the add-on, the remove menu item will be executed, and in this case I'm just testing if it exists, I just remove it. So having the menu items ready, let's move on to the next part. Next part is the different metadata you can have in the system. In our simple sample, for time's sake, we will not put in metadata, but essentially what you need to do is you need to put in all the different tables you want to create in this in your plugin. You will need to create in this method. You can do it in the different standard way you normally do. Again, this is all standard SDK work, but there's two changes you need to know. You need to always check if your table already exists, and if it doesn't, you should create it. And if you create it, you should set this boolean metadata equals true. Same goes for fields, keys, and UDOs. So checking if a table exists can be done from the UOTB, fields for CUFD, and so forward. But in our case, since we don't need them, we will just delete them for now. And again, I can delete them because they only override the base, and that will take care of the data if we don't do anything. Next up is SetupData. SetupData will be called during startup after all the metadata has been created, and it's a good place to do your default configurations for tables. For example, if you have a configuration table, there might be a default record. You might need to set up some default data in general, and that should all be done in the SetupData. Again, in our case, we don't have any data, so we just remove the method here. Next up is the setup event filter, and that is the one we always need to have because it was an abstract in the base class. And setup event filter is a bit different from the core SDK because we need to work in a special way so we can join the different event filters from the plugins and the usability package itself. But what you essentially have at your capabilities, just like you have your SBO application for setting up menu items, you have something called event filter. So if you call event filter, which are on the plugin adapter, you have the option to add different event filters. So in our case, we need to have the menu click, of course, and we can either stop here and say we want to have menu clicks for every single form in the system, or we can send along different form types as we go along here, just in an endless stream. But in our case, let's just say up we want to have menu click registered all the places, but you can see if you had some form load, some item presses, you could do it just like this. In our case, we only want to work with the menu click, so we only have that. And in the end, it will return that event filter, and usability package will then take it along and merge it with its own event filter. Good. So let's move on. Next thing we can set up is we can set up a user permission tree. So that is additional authorizations within Business One, and again, standard functionality of the SDK. If you want to have a permission tree, you can set it up. If you don't want to, you can skip it. So let's in our case skip it, and the next one will also skip, but it's post license check. And if you have a licenses check, in our case we said we didn't have, we will get this post license check method called every time we have made our license check, and it will return to you if the license was actually valid for your component. And if your license is not valid for your component, you should essentially call your remove menu items, because you shouldn't present the menu items to a customer who does not have a valid license. You don't need to make any error messages or anything, because that will be taken care of by the usability package itself. You don't need to do that. You only need to remove your menu items and what else you have put on the screen at that moment. But again, since we don't have a license check here, we'll just take it away. In our case, we won't have really any big events either. Normally, in most cases, you will have some item events on your own screen or on the existing screens for custom validation, and you can see it's exactly the same as if you had it from your system. You will need to set out the system, the different bubble events, and take the form type, turn it into the form that was the event form. You have the p-val, so you can do all your logic regarding item events. Again, just a simple, perhaps copy paste from an old add-on and put it in here. But in our case, let's remove it. The same goes for the form data event. Again, one of the events in the system. The menu event we will leave because we need that, but let's get rid of the print event, the progress bar event, and in the case if you need the progress bar event, there's some specials on the event filter where you need to tell the system that you want to catch the progress bar events or the status bar events, because they are not set up in the event filter normally, but you can set them up here if you want to. Again, we don't need it. We don't need the report data events, and we don't need the right click events or the status bar events. So essentially, we only need our menu event and set up filter, create our menu items, and remove our menu items. So now let's begin writing our logic. And since we are in the menu event, I only switch on the menu item, and in case we have our menu item BOY XX1 and break it, and we have it in p-val not before action, we should do our logic. So let's make a method called handle import logic. Let's look at this and let's create the methods. So it's now up to us to create our logic on actually importing. So I've now jumped ahead and implemented the import logic. Again, we will go through it, but we will not go into details on it because there's different scenarios for different imports, and also I have not used any time on error handling and so on. It's a very heavy part case where I'm just using the data. But let's go through it quickly. First thing is I've made a few additional files, and I have added a reference to system.windows.form so I can have an open file dialog. I've made my little own open file dialog here, and because standard open file dialogs cannot happen without not being in a thread in SAP, I have a little helper file that can give me the result of being able to have a file. So nothing special, tons of different ways to do it. So, but essentially it just asks me for a file, and if I got a file, I send it through a file controller, where it essentially just takes the file, puts it into a stream reader, peek to every single one of them, splits the different lines, in the first part being the item code, second part being the price lists, third part being the price, and the last part being the currency. Again, a lot of error handling can happen, should be done, but in this case I have not done it for the time's sake. Then we have some data in a final model, which is just a simple logo object, and I loop to each single one of them, have a price importer controller that simply just take along the sub company. You can see again in the plugin we have both the SAP company and the SAP application on which every single thing of the SDK is done. So I send that into my controller, and I send in the file model. I use the company to get my template object of the items, use the get by key on the item code, loop through the different prices until I find the correct price list, set the price and the currency, and do the updates. And again, some error handling if we couldn't update or if we didn't even find the item. Again, up to you to create that functionality using standard features. And finally, I'm simply just taking a message box and saying that my import is complete. So quite simple code, which we now have implemented. Now we need to package it up and add it to usability package for running. In order to make the package, first of all I need to prepare the code, so I need to be in release mode. And I need to make sure that I'm compiling as x86, so it runs on both 32 and 64 bits. I will then rebuild my code and go to the Explorer and find that in my x86 release folder I now have these files. This is what is consisting of my add-on that I need to package along. So let's take those, close the different windows, so we are back on our screen, make a new folder called raw data, and in here we put our data. Next up is again that we look into our plugin development kit that we got from our source, and we see here that we have a plugin packer installer. This is the tool that is used to turn your files into the actual package. So you need to install this, and once installed, you will end up with this tool. So first thing we need to do in this tool, we have a separate video on it, but quickly we need to find our folder, and our folder was the raw data, and we need to put in an output folder, and let's make on the system here a folder called My First Plugin. This the folder is here behind the scenes. We need to put in an identifier of what our plugin was called, so we called VOY MyPlugin, and the name of the add-on or the plugin itself is My Cool First Plugin. Description: this imports prices from a file. Some more information if you have a website dedicated to the plugin or specific sites. So let's just call it by my team, and you will here need to tell the system if it requires a valid license. In our case we didn't, else you need to check it. And let's make our first version of this and tell the system that it as minimum requires B1 usability package 5. We need to put a partner name and a partner email, so you can be contacted if you have some issues with that. You can save this file for later for reuse when you need to go to version 1.1 and so on. So let's save this plugin packer file, this, and we again have one of the plugin packer files here. So let's try to generate this. It has now generated our plugin, and we'll see we have MyPlugin version 1.0.0.bpf. So with our new plugin, we will now register into usability package. So we end up in the plugins and say manage plugins, and we register our plugin, and we call it, let's find it, My First Plugin. And it now says the plugin is added to the database, and let's activate it for this database and restart usability package in order for this to take effect. Okay, so our plugin is now installed. You may not see it, but it should actually be up and running. And under our inventory, we now have our import item prices. We can try to use it. We have our import file, and because we only had 2 items, it was fairly quick, so it imported 2 items, and we can now see that our item was updated with the new price, and the other item was updated with the new price compared to the file we had. So in our summary, we've just created our first plugin. Plugins maybe seem a bit hard to work with here, because you can't really run the code until you actually put it into the system. So what is normally done in the system is you create your plugin in a very standard fashion with nothing really in there, and You then need to go into the app data folder, because under app data usability package you will see there's the plugin folder. This is where the add-on comes into the system, and you can see here's your DLL files. So if you during the time of building you get new files, you can simply copy those into this folder, start the add-on again, and you have a new instance of your test running. So you don't need to package up every single time. If you're just testing, just build the system. You can even, if you're a little smart, go in and set up some build events that post a build event, go in, kill the usability package executable, and move the files to that specific folder if needed. You can also, of course, make your own little test runner, hooking up your MyPlugin and simply executing as well. It's not a big deal to do, but it helps when you actually develop your code. You can also have a different add-on and just have the same names of these folders and copy paste over in if you need to. So that was the conclusion of this, and you can see that in very few minutes we can make this. The hard part is of course making the business logic, as always, but turning it into a plugin for usability package is quite easy. So I hope you enjoyed what you've seen today. If you have questions, ask them on the support, as we would love to help you settle in your plugins. And if your plugins become popular, you should consider perhaps having a license on them, and in that case contact us and we'll set you into the license model system as well. So thank you for attending.